Thank you, Mr. President. On the Smithsonian, I know that your administration is seeking to weed out a lot of this left-wing spin that's in the museums, but we're seeing from people like Brian Stelter or other commentators that they're insinuating that you are trying to change history according to your narrative. What's your response to that, and is there anything you particularly like to do?
Well, we want the museums to treat our country fairly. We want the museums to talk about the history of our country in a fair manner, not in a woke manner or in a racist manner, which is what many of them, not all of them, but many of them are doing. Our museums have an obligation to represent what happened in our country over the years, good and bad, but what happened over the years in an accurate way. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, press. Thank you, press. Thank you. Thanks, guys. Cut it out right here. Thank you, press. Thanks, guys. Cut out right this way, right this way. Thanks, guys. Keep coming. Let's go, guys.
We've been listening to President Donald Trump inside the Oval Office as he's been answering reporters' questions. This was an event marking the 90th anniversary of Social Security, the president touting what his administration has done, he says, to advance Social Security. He did take some important questions from reporters on a number of different issues, perhaps most notably on his upcoming summit with Vladimir Putin tomorrow in Anchorage, Alaska. The president saying there that he thinks that Putin and Zelensky will make peace. He says we'll see if they get along. He did acknowledge that the conflict in Ukraine is more complicated than he had thought. Remember, during his campaign, he had said that it was a conflict that he would broker peace for within days. That clearly has not happened. He's talked about Vladimir Putin stringing him along. He was also asked whether having Putin here in the United States was actually a symbolic victory for the Kremlin, given that Putin has been ostracized as a result of U.S. and European policy for his actions in invading Ukraine. The president there disputing that idea, saying that it is not a victory for Putin, rather a victory for the United States to have Putin here.
There are a lot of other things, too, because we've been watching the expectations game over the past week as we've been barreling towards this meeting tomorrow. And this quote stood out to me that President Trump was asked if a ceasefire is basically what he wants to come out of this meeting. And again, he said today, just now, tomorrow all I want to do is set the table for the next meeting. Again, different language than consequences before. It's kind of taken a amorphous approach, if you will, or again, a back and forth approach at least as we again approach this meeting. The other thing that I thought, though, that was interesting was he did say when he described this second potential meeting, if things go well tomorrow with Vladimir Putin, that perhaps I might bring some of the European leaders along to a potential trilateral meeting. So that also stood out to me as well. We want to go to some of our reporters who are standing by. We have CNN's Elena Treen, CNN's Jim Sciutto in Anchorage for us, and Michael Bosserque, the former spokesperson for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Let's start with Elena, who's in, or I should say, at the White House and has been listening along. Elena, what were your big takeaways from what we just heard from the president just there?
Well, one of the other things I think as it relates to this Putin summit tomorrow is how he described the difficulty of trying to find an end to the war between Russia and Ukraine. It's something we know he has personally felt, but he rarely says this out loud. He essentially said that he thought that this war would be the easiest one. He was talking about all the different conflicts he has intervened in. He said, I thought this one would be the easiest one, but it's proven to be the most difficult. Just giving you a little bit more of his mindset as he heads to Anchorage tomorrow. But some of the other points, again, you kind of pointed them out, but I do think the idea that he keeps going back to this idea that this is looked at as a first meeting, that he believes this one-on-one with Vladimir Putin is the start of what could be a potentially very long process of trying, to find a real tangible agreement and off-ramp to the conflict. He said that, he thinks it'll be a good meeting, but that the second meeting would be even more important. And then that part about him saying that the second meeting must include Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in addition to having Putin in the room. The idea that he's saying that potentially some European leaders could be part of that as well, I think shows the effect that these different calls and really the work we've seen the United States allies in Europe really do to try and set the stage for this meeting, to try and bend President Donald Trump's ear before he sits down with Putin is, in some ways been successful. The president has, this week we've heard him repeatedly argue that he's close with a lot of these European leaders, that he thinks the work they're doing to try and help end this conflict has been great. Not the same rhetoric we've heard from him in recent months. So it really shows, I think, how those those conversations are helping shape what he's looking to get out of this meeting tomorrow, and really this idea that this could be the start of a longer process.
Let's go to Jim Sciutto, who's in Anchorage, Alaska, where the summit is set to take place. And Jim, it's important to fact check here, as President Trump says that if it weren't for him, Vladimir Putin would have taken all of Ukraine. It was actually the swift action of the previous administration and President Biden in aligning not only U.S. capabilities, but also NATO and European allies to push Russia out of Ukraine as Putin was attempting a full takeover of the country.
Let's get you to Alaska with NBC News White House correspondent Monica Alba. She's in Anchorage ahead of tomorrow's summit. Also with us, former Biden State Department spokesperson Ned Price and Counsel on Foreign Relations President Emeritus Richard Haass. Monica, we're starting to learn how things are going to play out tomorrow, what will be discussed. Walk us through it.
Exactly, Anna. It's going to be, it sounds like, a lengthy meeting between Russia and the United States tomorrow. We know that President Trump and President Putin will have some one-on-one time. And of course, that's really significant because what is discussed there, there's an open question of how we will learn about it, what was potentially promised, what could potentially come out of that, and how that's messaged is the real key question to this incredibly consequential face-to-face, even though the White House is downplaying some expectations about what could come out of it. Now, after they meet together, which it could be a lengthy amount of time, we don't know, we'll see, the two delegations will then meet with their top senior officials, and they will work through that bilateral session for another extended amount of time. And then we know, the Kremlin announced it first, and the White House confirmed it this morning, that then the two men will have a joint press conference. Now, remember back to when they last stood side by side and answered some questions back in Helsinki, where, of course, the president notably took the side of Vladimir Putin over the intelligence community. So that, of course, will be a very high stakes moment. But again, the White House is trying to set the stakes low here, saying that this is a feel out meeting. This is a listening exercise, in the words of White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt. The president himself said that he would know perhaps within the first 2 minutes of sitting down with President Putin whether this would be a worthwhile discussion to see if they can get to any kind of potential ceasefire here. But the real question is, what are the specifics that might be nailed down tomorrow ahead of then what would be the next phase of this, which could be a meeting with Ukrainian President Zelensky, who, of course, for now is not expected to be a part of these talks here in Anchorage tomorrow. Anna.
Ned, we know that the president of Russia will be traveling with quite a large group of people, including the foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, foreign affairs aide, defense minister, finance minister, special envoy for investment. What's your reaction to the makeup of the Russian delegation and this idea for a joint presser after Trump to stand side by side with someone who invaded an ally whose country is widely considered a cybersecurity threat to the U.S.? Is all this standard?
Well, both are incredibly problematic, Anna. First, on the delegation itself, for the American president to meet one-on-one, presumably with interpreters in the room with the Russian president, we've seen this before and only once before, and that's been in Donald Trump's first term. Leaving aside what President Trump might say or might share with President Putin, it is incredibly dangerous to do this because literally no one else is going to know what was said. It is not the job of the interpreter to take notes. It's the job of the interpreter to share the language, to make sure they understand one another. If there are no notes circulated to the Secretary of State, to the Defense Department, to the intelligence community, the U.S. government won't be able to operationalize or even to know what the two leaders discussed. To your second element, look, the press conference is equally problematic. You can fault President Trump for having the summit for a number of reasons. He's doing so without President Zelensky. He's doing so without any concrete, viable, and certainly just proposal on the table. But he's also giving President Putin what he wants. And President Putin, ever since President Obama called Russia a regional power, has wanted nothing more than to be on the world stage with the American president. He covets this platform, this literal platform right next to the president of the United States. And to have these two men standing next to one another, literally on the same plane, answering questions from reporters, well, that's already a victory for Vladimir Putin. And that's even before whatever comes out of President Trump's mouth. Of course, we saw this in July of 2018. We know how that ended, with President Trump siding with President Putin, the guy next to him, over the U.S. intelligence community. That gives me real concern about what we're going to see tomorrow.
Richard, today, Putin previewed the meeting, saying the Trump administration is making, quote, quite energetic and sincere efforts to stop the hostilities, stop the crisis, and reach agreements that are of interest to all parties involved in this conflict. Richard, Putin knows what President Trump sees as a win. Trump wants to be able to say he ended the war. How will Putin use that to his advantage going into this talk when he has this face-to-face, potentially just he and Trump in the room together with no one else?
Well, it's always dangerous in negotiations to want an agreement too much. And one has to hope that President Trump's enthusiasm or desire to be a successful peacemaker doesn't get out of hand, and that he signs on to an agreement that essentially gives Putin what he wants. And Putin is interested not just in territory, let's be honest. He wants to weaken Ukraine as an independent, sovereign entity. Ukraine's very existence is a thorn in his side, because Ukraine is a Slavic country that is democratic with ties to the West. So Putin has a big agenda. His fallback agenda probably is, if he can't get a ceasefire or an agreement on his terms, he doesn't want to be blamed for it.
What we're seeing here is Trump get humiliated before his meeting with Putin, and Putin wants you to see that. He wants you to know that he's going to go in there and beat Trump in this one-on-one meeting. And I want to be clear. That's not necessary. People saying that, they're not necessarily saying, oh, we're cheering for Putin to win, right? It's more just like Donald is walking into a trap, and the result of which is either he just, as he has in the past, bends the knee to Putin because he wants to, because ideologically, Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump are allies. They're not identical, but they're allies. Or he just gets played so hard he doesn't even realize it. And that first part I showed you there really should strike concern into the hearts of anybody hoping for a good outcome for Ukraine, and just to not embolden Putin, because Trump says, I'm going to feel it out. I'm just going to play this one by ear, right? Which is concerning, that it seems like he's going in without a plan. That he's going into this meeting without a plan, right? That he doesn't have a real sense of what his goals are, what his red lines are, what he thinks the goals and red lines are of the other side, what the interests are of Ukraine and United States allies, who he has to consider as well. It seems like none of that, he's got none of that. And look, I understand to a certain degree, in a meeting like this, not everything can be fully regimented. You got to have a bit of flexibility. But going in on vibes, when I'm pretty sure Putin has game planned all, 1 million possible scenarios, I'm going to be hyperbolic, but has game planned dozens and dozens of scenarios based on what Trump says and doesn't say, leads me to believe he's already lost.